a privilege and honor for me to be here this afternoon to help celebrate the life of Daniel Edward Kelleher.
Dude to his grandkids, my dad had a paper route at age 12.
Dude and I both shared a love for music.
I could always count on Dude for a physics lesson, a laugh, a hug. I'll miss him dearly, but man, am I glad that I knew him.
So here we are to honor Daniel and his life together in this virtual and very real place of gathering.
Our family that aren't here, like, they also thought she was their grandma. She was everyone's grandma. And I only hope that I can live up to her. Thank you all for being here. I love you so much.
I didn't expect anybody other than Debbie and me to be here.
We thought we were going to be all alone, and we got everybody. Oh, it means so much to us.
Suzanne and I am the Gathering Us facilitator for today's event. We are going to get started today by watching a slideshow.
During these days of struggle, we really need to have words of hope.
While I and my family stand deeply grieved, we are also thankful for the chance to have had her.
I'm so happy everybody could do this. We were feeling very lonely.
Thank God for technology.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Thank you all from the bottom of my heart for coming here and doing this with us. It took a little convincing to mom and dad that this would work, but I'm glad they did.
Good morning, everybody, or it's good afternoon now. Welcome to Green Funerals Week. Thank you to our sponsor, Gathering Us. We just saw that little video about the services they're offering, and our PMA members get a discount on that. So if that's something you might be interested in, go ahead and visit our website. Okay, so I'd like to begin by saying that People's Memorial Association would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Coast Salish, Duwamish, and Suquamish nations on which we work and live. Our office is physically located in Seattle, and most of our staff live in the surrounding areas as well. Though we're very lucky to have Brian Flowers joining us all the way up from Bellingham today.
Thank you, Beverly.
Yeah.
I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from traditional Lummi and Nooksack lands.
Wonderful.
What is green burial? Middle of Green Funeral Week, so this seems pretty essential. Let's see, green burial, back up here. High school or college speech director always told me establish ethos before you begin a speech. So I am the managing funeral director for Moles Farewell Tributes up in Bellingham. I'm also the green burial coordinator for Green Acres Memorial Park, where the Meadow Natural Burial Ground that I designed and developed is. And I am the past president of the Green Burial Council as well. And so I get to talk to you about green burial, which is just about one of my all-time favorite things to do. Green burial, in a nutshell, is burial without embalming in a 100% biodegradable burial container. That could be a woven wicker casket. That could be a solid wood casket. That could be a cloth shroud. It could be a handmade lowering pallet and great-grandmother's quilt. Green burial does away with the outer burial container. There's no concrete or metal vault that goes into the ground first. And it is also used as a vehicle for ecological restoration and landscape level conservation. And we're going to unpack exactly what that means. what we've talked about in this nutshell definition here are the environmental benefits of green burial, and we'll get into those in detail. But what's really exciting about green burial, and we'll talk about this towards the end, is the meaning-making opportunities that it provides for us around grief and healing after a death. So green burial, no embalming. Let's start there. How did we get to this point in our culture where the status quo is we call a funeral home when someone dies? Professionals, usually in a suit and tie, come and whisk the body away within 30 to 60 minutes of receiving that call. We never see the body again. If we do, in the rare occasions, they're usually embalmed and cosmetized and then sealed in steel and concrete or incinerated. Because it didn't used to be this way. There didn't used to be a professional class that you called in when a death occurred. 150, 200 years ago, most folks died within about 5 miles of where they resided. They were brought home, laid out in the parlor. Just as an aside here for a moment, how many of you, with a virtual show of hands, have a living room in your house or apartment? I see one of you in a yurt. You may or may not have a living room there. How many of you have a parlor? I don't have a parlor. There was an article in a Ladies' Home Journal in, I believe, 1923, where the author of the article stated very clearly, we no longer lay the dead out in our parlors. We have now a professional class that we hire to do this for us. Let's reclaim this room for the living. And now and forevermore, we have called it the living room. Just a little historic aside. So the deceased were laid out in the parlor and cared for by people that knew them in life. Oftentimes that job fell to the women, while the men went to the churchyard and dug the grave and prepared the casket. They might have gone to the local cabinet maker to get the casket made. And then hands that knew this decedent lifted them into the casket, carried them to the church, and then carried them to the cemetery and buried them together. No money was exchanged. No professionals were called. And then the Civil War happened. And young men, especially from the North, were dying by the hundreds and thousands in the fields, battlefields in the South. And it presented quite a challenge, especially in the hot summer months, to get their remains back home to the North for a proper burial in a way that was recognizable to their family. And so field embalmers were the first embalmers. They were utilizing a chemical-based solution based with arsenic instead of formaldehyde. We had no idea at the time how toxic arsenic was for us, and it was an incredibly effective preservative. So these embalmers, in fact, it was highly competitive. They would follow the battles and they would set up a tent just at the outskirts of the battle. There was an embalming tent. A soldier would fall in the field of battle. His buddies would gather him up. They would pass a hat and collect funds to pay for his embalming and take him to the tent, where often the latest embalming was displayed as an example of this individual's handiwork. Pretty grim stuff. Prior to that, embalming had been frowned upon in North America and throughout Christendom as a throwback to the ancient pagan ways of Egypt. And it was pretty frowned upon. But the Civil War began to change that. And then when Lincoln was assassinated, he was placed in an open casket in a Pullman car on a train that made the whistle stop tour, taking him back home. Every major city and every little crossroads the train stopped at, heads of state, international dignitaries, and ma and pop kettle got a chance to see Lincoln. And at that time, we all knew what a dead body looked like because we had all had them in our homes at some point in time. And they looked at Lincoln and said, my goodness, he looks like he's asleep. He doesn't look dead. He looks like he could just wake up. And all of a sudden now, embalming became something in vogue for the elites. And the companies that manufactured these chemicals realized they were onto something. And to market this to the greater population, they needed to create a whole new set of tradespeople, and they called them morticians. Rhymes with physicians. It was an attempt to elevate that trade to the respected level of physician. And then the chemical companies started creating funeral trade schools, embalming schools, training this new generation of morticians in the application of these chemicals. And so a professional class began to grow. To this very day, most mortuary science programs, if not outright owned by chemical companies, are significantly underwritten by chemical companies, which is an interesting thing because it tells us who they're beholden to and what they're teaching, and maybe more importantly, what they're not teaching in those schools. Concurrent to this was the development of burial vaults. Burial vaults were originally developed as these handmade contraptions that were designed to dissuade grave robbers. Their purpose was to make robbing a grave very labor intensive. And 150, 200 years ago, do you know why graves were being robbed? It wasn't for jewels, it wasn't for gold and teeth, it was for fresh cadavers. At the time, it was illegal to dissect cadavers in physician training in medical schools. But medical schools knew that they couldn't train physicians and surgeons without physical hand-on experience with human physiology and anatomy. So a black market trade developed of disinterring freshly buried cadavers, usually poor and minorities, and selling their remains in after hours into the back end of medical schools. And so vaults, burial vaults, were designed to dissuade people from doing this, to make it labor intensive. And with the Industrial Revolution, they switched from being these handmade contraptions to industrial produced and mass produced and marketed products. And along with this, burial vault manufacturers started making caskets as well. And we have these streams coming together to create what is really now the modern funeral industry. And we can't talk about green burial without talking about it in contrast to the modern funeral industry, because it really arose out of that. In the mid-90s, Dr. Billy Campbell and his wife, Kimberly Campbell, a southern rural country doctor from South Carolina, were on a road trip through the Midwest. And they were visiting some of the historic prairies in the Midwest and realized in that these were the last remnants of tall grass prairie species. Prairie cemeteries in the Midwest are reserves of native habitats because they were spared the plow because they were considered sacred ground. And Billy and Kimberly started wondering, well, if this could have been done accidentally, what could we do on purpose? Could we utilize the burial of human remains as a way of preserving pristine native wilderness and engaging in ecological restoration? And they opened Ramsey Creek Preserve in South Carolina in 1998, the first green burial cemetery in the United States. It was a few years after that, in 2007, when I first learned about green burial, I was working as a cabinet and furniture maker in a small custom high-end woodworking shop. And the pantry of a pine kitchen that we were working on, as it was laying on the back of a shop deck, looked very similar to a plain pine casket. And the guys I worked for had looked at their business license that same week and realized they were licensed as cabinet and casket makers, which is a throwback to that 150, 200 years ago, because you would often go to the local cabinet maker to get the casket made. In fact, John Moles, who I now work for, who's the fourth generation owner of Moles Farewell Tributes, his great grandfather, the founder, was the mayor and cabinet and furniture maker in Ferndale, Washington. So there was a historic precedent for this move. And I actually, in that first conversation, as we were looking at that pantry and wondering, what would it look like for us to make inexpensive plain pine caskets? John Moles is an old family friend, so I called him up to pick his brain about price points and distribution. In that first conversation, he said, well, you know, we work with a casket maker just in Abbotsford, right across the border, that specializes in plain pine caskets. Economies of scale, I can probably get that final casket for about what you guys get your materials for. And he knew of the shop and our specializing in sustainably and locally harvested woods. And he mentioned in that first conversation, but if I could get a locally made, sustainably harvested solid wood casket, we could talk about green burial. When I said, what's green burial? He gave me that nutshell definition, and I had my imagination captured in a way nothing ever had. I followed and kept tabs on green burial for the intervening year and had some conversations with John over the course of the year. He shared a bunch of articles with me, and I started boring the guys I worked with as I started waxing philosophic about the Cartesian mind-body duality, and nothing epitomizes our divorce from the natural world more than contemporary funeral practices. And they would yell at me, shut up, Flowers, and go sand something. And I realized I had to do something about this. I was having trouble falling asleep at night. I was thinking about the possibilities. So I called John again and said, hey, can we talk? And we sat down together and I said, look, I know you want green burial to happen, but you're a business owner. You don't have time to do this. This is so brand new. There are only 3 green burial cemeteries in the country right now, and just a handful of funeral homes that even know what this is. It's probably not on your staff's radar. Bring me on board and I will make this happen. And he said, let's find room for you. And a year later, we opened the Meadow Natural Burial Ground. It was the 12th green burial cemetery in the country, and the first green burial cemetery certified by the Green Burial Council as a natural burial ground in an existing conventional cemetery. It's just to kind of give you the slow trajectory. In 1998, the first green burial cemetery opened up in the United States. In 2008, January of 2008, the 12th green burial cemetery opened. There are currently about 350 green burial cemeteries in the country now. This is gaining a head of steam momentum. It is a movement. So green burial takes place at a little shallower depth. We think of 6 feet under when we think of burial, right? A green burial grave is usually dug to 3.5 or 4.5 feet. Brings us up to a higher strata of soil where there's microbes, oxygen, and moisture to facilitate a rapid aerobic ashes to ashes, dust to dust return. In this kind of setting, we anticipate that soft tissue returns to soil, especially in our moist temperate climate, in about 1 to 5 years. To further expedite this process, best practice say that we layer the bottom of the grave with mulch, biomass, leaves, twigs, sticks, cut grass, cut flowers, the top of the compost pile, wood chips, about 2 to 4 inches. And then the first layer of backfill is more biomass, leaves, twigs, sticks, cut grass, compost. And what this does, about 20% of the grave is this biomass. And this inoculates the area around the decedent with more microbes, oxygen, and to further expedite that ashes to ashes, dust to dust return. We contrast that to what happens in a conventional burial when someone has been embalmed or not embalmed, sealed up in steel and concrete, is a slow anaerobic process that is really a liquefaction process. And the anaerobic bacteria in that eventual resulting liquid is going to corrode any container despite the 50-year warranty on the casket in the vault. And let's just pause for a moment and let that sink in. A 50-year warranty on a casket in a burial vault? Who's checking? Despite those warranties, that liquid is going to corrode any container, and when it does, it's a liquid. It goes into the ground wall. With green burial techniques, soft tissue turns to soil in 1 to 5 years, and there's absolutely no impact on groundwater whatsoever. The microbes in that biomass form channels that pull the nutrients up from one microbe to the other through the biomass to the roots of the plants that they have ready access to, because there's no barrier there. We are truly able to become trees. There is a gentleman, Roger Williams. He is the founder of Rhode Island. He was a traveling itinerant preacher. And when he died, he was buried in a casket, wood casket. He was buried in a churchyard that was disinterred and set out to a more rural cemetery because development progress was pushing that cemetery out. In that second cemetery, again, the city expanded and he was disinterred and moved a second time, his third final resting place, the only thing marking his tree. In the early 30s, Mr. Williams a third time and display his skeletal remains in an ossuary box in a museum as the founder of Rhode Island. When they disinterred him, there were no skeletal remains to be found. There was a root of the apple tree growing in a straight line, splitting where his hips would have been, growing in two lines with a little rise where his knees were, and terminating in an upswoop where his feet would have been. I offer that story as an illustration to show you that we can become a tree, and the techniques with green burial provide for that. One of the first things people ask when they hear about that shallower depth of a green burial grave is, are animals going to smell it? Are they going to come dig up the grave? The smell barrier is 18 inches. Anything covered with 18 inches of soil has no detectable odor except to bears and highly trained cadaver dogs, which is usually not an issue at all. I've kept my finger on green burial around the country, and there has never been a case in the United States of a green burial grave being desecrated. So to add to that 18 inches of soil, we mound the earth above a green burial site. And I'm actually going to show you some slides that are going to illustrate what we're talking about here. So give me a moment as I get the screen share all set up here. And so these slides are just going to roll in the background as I talk for a while. And I do want to note that the individual in the shroud, most of these slides are from the service of a woman named Lori Otto, who is a prominent environmentalist. In her pre-arrangement, she made it very, very, very clear that her burial was to be used to educate people about green burial. And so I use these photos with the family. So the purpose of a vault in a conventional cemetery is twofold. Primarily, it supports the earth above the burial site so that because even that steel casket is going to degrade in the ground. And when it does, there's a lot more empty space in there than there is solid material, and you get a sinkhole effect. And in a modern conventional cemetery, when you're running backhoes and excavators and service trucks and riding lawnmowers over the ground, you have to have something stabilizing the earth above the burial, which is the primary purpose of a vault. The vault also insulates, imagine you're digging in between two existing burials. It's a 4-foot wide grave and you have a 3-foot bucket on your backhoe. You want to make sure you got something solid to bump up against on either side so you're not disturbing the neighbors. So when we do away with the vault and the green burial, we mound the earth above the site to compensate for the settling that occurs without that vault. And that adds to that layer so that there's ample soil so that smell barrier is well in place. So that's the basics of green burial. As I said, it can be utilized as a vehicle for ecological restoration. I'm going to utilize the Meadow Natural Burial Ground as an example for this, not for promotional purposes, but simply because I'm intimately aware of what's happening out there. I have detailed knowledge, and so that's the best thing I can share. When we began the development of the Meadow, we had a senior biologist come out and do a full biological evaluation on the entire 4.5 acres that make up the Meadow. In that process, highlighted an area that we have a seasonal aquifer recharge zone, a high water table half the year, where we're never going to do full body burials. It's an environmentally sensitive area. She also cataloged for us all of the existing flora, native and invasive, helped us develop an integrated pest management plan for the invasive species, which have recently, much to my delight, involved goats, helping us with blackberry in an area of the meadow that's yet to be developed, has no active burials, and a small flock of sheep clearing the way of common tansy for us as well. And then developed a site-suitable native plant list for us. For each burial that we do in the meadow, we plant 3 native plants on or near the burial site. And we tend these plants like we do plants in the garden. And slowly, over time, we're restoring this 4.5 acres as a thriving native ecosystem. And we're doing it at nature's pace. It works very well. Conventional ecological restoration is often referred to as the scorched earth method. It's publicly funded, so the agency that funds it needs to see results in 3 to 5 years usually. So they come in, they take out all of the existing flora, native and invasive, take out the topsoil because it has a seed load of invasive species in it, bring irradiated topsoil in, and then try to mimic 200 years of natural succession in the course of 5 to 10 years. It's not very effective, as you might imagine. We're a cemetery. We have nothing but time. We're not going anywhere. And so we're doing this at nature's pace. We're slowly putting in little pockets of native vegetation, tending to them lovingly. And as they grow and expand and we add more and more over time, they start to grow into one another and create these colonies of native species. As the canopy grows up, it will outcompete the native or the non-native, the invasive pasture grasses. And then we are actively managing through a variety of methods the primary invasive species of Himalayan blackberry, common tansy, and a little bit of Scotch broom as well. And those memorial plantings then become, how do I say this? Sacred, if you will. We invite every single family to come back and participate in the planting of those native species, which we do in the fall to give them the best opportunity to take hold. And so either 1 to about 24 months have transpired since the burial. And then we come back and put new life in the ground. And we talk about the nitrogen cycle, how the molecules in this person's body are being digested by microbes and transferred to the roots of the plants that they have the ready access to, and then are being picked up by pollinators and taken off into the natural cycles that they have participated in since they were forged in the furnace of a star eons and eons and eons ago. And it can be an incredibly healing process. So that's ecological restoration. Let's talk about landscape level conservation and how that works with green burial. For an example of that, I'm going to take us down to just east of Goldendale, Washington, to White Eagle Preserve. White Eagle Preserve is a 20-acre conservation cemetery in the midst of a 1,300-acre pristine wilderness working horse ranch called Oconee Ranch that is owned by the Sacred Earth Foundation. And I am going to just, there we go. And so what they did at White Eagle, well, they're the founder of Oconee Ranch, which began in the mid-70s as a place for inner city underserved kids to go and experience wilderness and the therapeutic benefits of being with horses. Everyone there, when the founder died, could not imagine his body leaving the property. He had spent so much of his life developing this and acquiring adjacent property as it came up for sale, bringing it onto the same piece of property, same deed. So they scrambled, and over the course of 6 months, while keeping him in refrigeration in a funeral home in Goldendale, created the cemetery, a 20-acre cemetery in the midst of their continuous 1,300 acres. The state of Washington, because all 1,300 acres are on the same deed, recognizes all of it as a cemetery. So it can never be developed as anything else. Concurrent with that are conservation easements that run on the property that prevent it from being developed. At the same time, White Eagle Preserve is generating revenue through the sale of plots and the sale of their opening and closing fees. White Eagle, once they have covered their overhead with the cemetery, puts the remainder of those funds into an account earmarked to acquire additional pieces of property that are adjacent when they come up for sale and bring them onto the same deed and extend their conservation efforts. Also, by state law, they created an endowment care trust fund, which they had to seed with $25,000. And then every time they sell a plot, by law, they have to charge an additional 10% and put that 10% as a contribution into the endowment care fund. The idea is a cemetery is a business with a shelf life. It will eventually run out of space and go out of business. And when it does, you can't just put the shutters on it and walk away from it. It is still has to be maintained into perpetuity. So the state requires that endowment care fund to make sure there is an endowment to maintain that piece of property after it no longer generates revenue. So what's happening here is pretty amazing. With conservation burial, we are creating sacred space that interacts with people on a daily basis for a variety of reasons. Conventionally, conserved property is usually insulated from humanity so we don't damage it, understandably so. But when we don't get to interact with a landscape, we don't value that landscape. When we don't value something, we don't fund it. That's why funding conservation efforts can be very challenging. So with a conservation cemetery, we've created sacred space that people value deeply, emotionally. They have a spiritual and emotional connection to it because their loved ones' remains are there. We generate revenue off of that land that goes to further conservation efforts, and we have endowed that land with a corpus of funds for its maintenance into perpetuity with no taxpayer dollars and no donation dollars whatsoever, all privately done. It's an amazing innovation, and we're starting to wake up to these possibilities. They're very intimidated because the management of a cemetery is a forever thing, and it's a pretty daunting task for them, but they are starting to figure this out and figuring out partners to work with for it, and it's pretty exciting. So the environmental benefits of green burial are remarkable. Conservation and restoration and a dramatic reduction of energy and chemical inputs. Just a real quick, every year in the United States, we bury enough reinforced concrete in burial vaults to build a 2-lane highway from the border of Canada, of British Columbia and Washington to the border of Oregon and California. Enough reinforced concrete to build a 2-lane highway from Canada to California. We bury enough casket steel every year to build the Golden Gate Bridge 1.5 times. We bury enough formaldehyde-based embalming fluid to fill 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools. We bury enough casket wood, most of it slow-growing hardwoods or chemical-infused particle board, to build 35,000 2,500 square foot houses. And that's just burial. Cremation has a pretty significant impact as well. It takes about 54 gallons of natural gas to cremate one individual. You times that by all of the cremations that happen over the course of a year, and that's a pretty significant impact. About 0.002% of the dioxins in the atmosphere can be attributed to cremation, as well as all of the fossil fuels that we're burning for that. Green burial eliminates most of that. One of the things people often ask about in green burial is memorialization. Every green burial cemetery handles this a little bit differently. The Meadow Natural Burial Ground, because it is in the context of a 40-acre conventional memorial park, offers permanent memorialization in the form of a native Washington stone, a boulder or a flat slab kept in its raw form, so it maintains the natural aesthetic in the meadow and is engraved like a granite marker would be. And everything for that takes place within about 120-mile radius of the meadow. So we have reduced the carbon footprint pretty significantly for memorialization compared to granite that's quarried in Pakistan or China and then imported to the US, or bronze that comes out of a bronze foundry. White Eagle Preserve and other conservation cemeteries have no form of permanent memorialization. Sometimes they'll offer just a native field stone that came out of the ground when it was dug, but unengraved, that's laid on the grave. Sometimes you can put a wood plaque on that is designed to return into the earth. Sometimes it's just the protection of the land that is memorialization. Sometimes there's communal memorialization outside of the environmentally sensitive area. So the environmental benefits of green burial are why most people approach it, why they come to it. But inevitably, people that have gone to a green burial, what are the dangers to the embalmer? I'm going to just take that question real quick. So in 2013, I think it was, the state of California finally listed formaldehyde as a known carcinogen. It was the funeral industry that blocked that listing for about 20 years. So modern preparation facilities usually have downdraft ventilation. Formaldehyde is heavier than air, so an updraft ventilation just pulls it right up past your nose and you inhale some. Downdraft ventilation pulls it down and out. So people coming into the trade as embalmers are probably pretty safe. Personal protective equipment is pretty advanced now, but I know a couple of embalmers that have been at it for 30 years who have no sense of smell whatsoever. And I can't remember the sarcoma that it is, but there's a certain kind of cancer that has a much higher rate amongst embalmers. So there are definitely dangers. In fact, that is the biggest reason to get embalming out of the funeral trade. In fact, in the ground, it breaks down into its constituent parts and becomes inert pretty quickly and doesn't really do much damage. What it does do is slow down the decomposition of human remains, then further creating more liquid that goes into the water table.
Talking about that, Brian, would you mind taking another question about embalming?
Yeah, absolutely.
Someone else was saying, I don't know if you've been attending the Green Burial Council conference. I've been sneaking in every once in a while, but there was a speaker this past week, Jake Goodnow, and he said during his presentation that embalming fluid evaporates and doesn't cause environmental harm in soils. The person submitting the comment says that they're paraphrasing, but he made a point of pointing this out, and it was the first time that they'd ever heard anyone say that. Do you have any thoughts on that? That sounds kind of
well, and that
right.
that goes back, and that's funny. I talked to Jack quite a bit about 2 weeks ago as he was preparing for his presentation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, as that really goes back to what I said before. The biggest reason to get embalming out of the funeral trade is for protection of embalmers. It really doesn't do much damage in the ground at all. Like I said, the only damage it really does is slowing down the decomposition rate of human remains, which then creates that anaerobic environment.
Yeah, someone else is pointing out that concern that you've expressed about the morticians that are handling deceased and embalming them. Isn't it true that those folks have the highest rate of cancer, specifically leukemia?
There is a specific cancer. It's not leukemia. It's something sarcoma. I can't remember the Italian words, but there is a kind of cancer that has a much higher rate amongst embalmers. Yes, that is true.
We have a couple more here if you want to tackle those since you're on a groove right now.
Yeah. Although I really want to take a few minutes to get into the meaning-making opportunities with green burial. Yes, PPEs, modern PPEs, which continue to advance, go a long way, as do modern downdraft ventilation systems. But you know, every funeral home is different around the country, and especially on the West Coast, we have a lot more advanced hospital quality embalming rooms. You get to the Midwest, the South, and the Northeast, and you get a little more traditional one where embalming is more expected. They don't have refrigeration as much, that sort of thing. Oh, that's a great question. Restoration for viewing. I'm gonna put that one aside because there's a lot to unpack there and come back to it if we have time towards the end. Other than to say it is absolutely possible. And I have lots of experiences with the fact that everybody is viewable if you prep the family properly, and have some extreme examples of that can be done properly and can be very healing. I really want to talk about the effect of green burial on the grieving and healing process for folks. There are, you know what? I'm going to tell you a story to highlight this. I'm going to tell you the story about Franklin. Franklin was violently murdered 3 days before his 19th birthday in his own home in North Seattle in what amounted to a drug deal gone bad. I sat down with his mother and father to make the arrangements. They were working with the funeral home in South Everett, Sacred Moment, and we were the cemetery. And I sat down with his parents to make the cemetery arrangements. And the entire time, his mom spoke in a whisper. It was like the wind had been knocked out of her. And in a very, very real way, it had been. Franklin's father's grief process involved him maintaining visual contact with his son for the entire process. So he selected a solid wood casket that he could physically remove himself the lid from, trimmed it down to fashion a prop system that lifted Franklin up in the casket so that if you're looking at him, you could see him proud of the sidewalls. The sidewalls came to about his shoulder, and then from here up, you could see him just looking straight on. There was an open casket funeral in an open casket. Closed casket wasn't an option. There wasn't a lid, in a church in North Seattle with 400 people in attendance. This young man had gunshot wounds. He had been autopsied, and some of the realities of death were starting to take hold. He was on dry ice for the service. He'd been in a temperature-controlled facility in the intervening time, and then was on dry ice for all services, which meet the requirements both legally and practically for temporary preservation of human remains pretty effectively. So that's a little bit of to answer the question of visitation, of how that can be done. Franklin's father required every single individual there to pay their respects at the casket. He was using this as an attempt to try to scare Franklin's friends. These are the wages of these activities. Please, please do not do this yourself. And then they made a procession. By the time they got up to Ferndale from North Seattle, 400 people had winnowed down to about 50. We met at the funeral home to place Franklin's casket on our caisson, that black hand-drawn cart that you saw in the slideshow before, for a procession from the funeral home back to the Meadow. We had brought a pall to place over Franklin because we couldn't pull the caisson through the cemetery with an exposed body. Even in the middle of January, when there was a foot and a half of snow on the ground and the northeaster was blowing at about 40 miles an hour, there's still people that come and walk and run every day and visit graves, and that would have been traumatic to them to pull that exposed body through the cemetery. But there's a berm that separates the Meadow from the rest of the cemetery. As soon as we got to it and through it, Franklin's father stopped and pulled the pall off. That service, most graveside services last about 15 to 30 minutes. We recite Psalm 23, sing Amazing Grace, say the Lord's Prayer, and oh, look at that, we all got to get back to work. Most green burials, graveside services last a minimum of 45 minutes to an hour. This was 4 hours, despite wind chill factor, keeping the temperature right around zero. After Franklin was lowered into the ground, the first layer of backfill was 1,000 origami paper cranes that friends and family had spent the intervening week folding. And then it came time to close Franklin's grave. We offer every family, usually in any green burial setting, the opportunity to close a grave by hand. Usually what we do is we have the pile of biomass there, the sand and topsoil in their respective orders. So we guard our topsoil layer and about 4 or 5 shovels so that we don't get tangled up. If we get any more of that, then there's too many people digging. Usually what happens is we have just a immediate family starts. You get about 10 shovelfuls in, 15, 20. Someone comes and taps you on the shoulder or the elbow. You pass your shovel on, and a community comes together to do what's necessary. And it is beautiful. It is a ritual. We roll up our sleeves, we break a sweat, and we do what needs to be done for this individual. And shovel work is not cerebral. We get to tear our brains off and let those motions start to process somatically through our body. In the case of Franklin's service, nobody tapped his father on the shoulder. Nobody took the shovel from him. In fact, after a while, he was the only one digging as we just made a circle around him and held space for this man while he buried his son. Despite the temperatures being around zero, the sweat poured down this man's face as he put every ounce of his grief into the end of that shovel. When we were all done, he came up and shook my hand and said, "Thank you. I know this sounds strange, but this was a pleasure." His mom gave me a hug and said, "I have my voice back." What we get to do in Green Burial in the midst of our radically de-ritualized culture is oftentimes very spontaneously craft relevant, contemporary, meaningful ritual around a death that helps us engage in our healing and grief process in a way that is very, very, very healthy. There's so much more we could unpack with that, but we're out of time. So I'd like to spend the last 15 minutes, if you have time to linger, taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was so powerful. We always love working with you because you always have the best illustrative stories that we could possibly imagine for the value of the work you're doing. We do have a couple questions here queued up for you, but if you don't mind, I would like to hop in for just a second to share some information with our participants. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so in case you would like access to this information later, we have been recording this session, so no worries if you'd like to share some of the power of this presentation with some other folks in your life. We'll be sending out a follow-up email afterwards with some different links and information so you can continue your research and share it around with your loved ones and maybe have some tough conversations with your own family about the things that you think you might be ready to start planning for. At People's Memorial, we're really proud to partner with Brian as often as we do. We wish there were more opportunities because it's just so powerful to reduce the stigma about death care and end of life. To share stuff like this is really wonderful. And we're really happy to have so many folks joining us here. I think we have about 75 folks in here right now. And that's really wonderful. We're really happy at People's Memorial to share these opportunities for free learning and sharing the different advocacy work we're doing to increase the green funeral options available to Washingtonians. We do have a couple more sessions coming up later this week, and we really hope to be able to see you there. We've got one on aquamation, natural organic reduction. We're really excited to do a fact or fiction one later this week. And then on Saturday, we're even hosting a little bit of a conversational, facilitated conversation about the things that we've been working on this week. So I'll make sure that we get all of that information included in that email out to you. So let's go ahead and tackle a couple of these questions. And if you think of a question later on, we'll make sure you have some contact information for Brian as well as us at People's Memorial. We're happy to tackle this. We're really, really committed to education for the community, and we love to do some research on these things. So no worries if we can't quite get to your question today. I see a couple questions in here for you, Brian, from some funeral service students in here. We've got a couple of budding morticians that are in the audience, and they would love to hear your insight about what kind of work those new students can seek out. The ones that are really interested in the advocacy about bringing green funeral into green burial into different communities, or any insight you have to offer about what that transition between the sort of industry education they're getting and maybe the type of work you're doing that might feel a little more meaningful to them.
I think this is probably a pretty exciting time to be looking at graduating mortuary science programs, because this industry is changing very quickly right now. It is a very conservative and slow to change industry, and but green burial has really as I mentioned very early on, gained a head of steam and is changing the dialogue across the country for even the most conventional of providers. I would caution you to probably try to stay away from the corporate funeral homes. I won't mention any names, but you're not going to get quite the reception there, or they're not going to be as amenable to the alternatives that are emerging. If you can work with a private family-owned funeral home, you will probably find yourself in a position to be a change agent, or maybe be in a position where a change is already underway and you get to help participate and further that. But that knowledge and that passion, I think you're going to find welcome increasingly so around the country.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So many things are changing, and it's really enriching the options available to families to get that care they really need.
It is.
So we do have a couple folks that really would love it if you'd circle back to that discussion about restoration. I mean, I'm admittedly pretty interested in that as well.
So in the most extreme cases, and there is a Green Burial Council certified embalming product. It's made by Champion, which is one of the two major producers of embalming products, prep room products. It's called Enigma, ENY. is spelled. So, and it is 100% plant-based. Think very, very, very concentrated essential oils, basically, with clove being one of the primary ingredients because of its antiseptic properties. So in a case where that really needs to be utilized, you have some options. I would suggest getting familiar with it before you utilize it for the first time. We keep it on stock. We don't use it very often. When we've had a new embalmer on board, we have offered it to families for free if they want embalming. Of, hey, can we use this product to give our staff a chance to get familiar with it? We're usually looking at a how do I say this, a low impact situation where we're not having like a big, huge open casket service, that sort of thing. And so, because it behaves very differently than traditional embalming products. So that is definitely an option. One of the things I want to say is in some cases, and this is no disrespect to restoration artists, because what you do is amazing. I'm not a licensed embalmer. I don't go in the prep room, so I have great appreciation for what you do. But everybody is viewable in the right circumstances. I have dealt with some very, very, very extreme situations, usually of younger folks where their parents need to see them in the state that they died in so that they can come to terms with this. And with the proper counseling of the family, with the proper managing of expectations and setting of the environment, it can be done. I have had one where we had a sheet over a young woman, and her arm and the one hand that didn't have damage, didn't have trauma, was out, so the family could identify her hand and hold her hand. I could tell you lots of very extreme stories, but we don't have time for that.
Sounds really powerful, though, just to have that opportunity for folks to say goodbye. What a wonderful product. I've never even heard of that. I wrote it down so I can learn a little more myself.
Okay.
So some of these morticians we've got hiding in the wings here, they're really curious. Is there a place that you would recommend for folks that are really interested in becoming a funeral director with a green burial focus? Are there any institutions or organizations they should look into? I think you're frozen, Brian.
And my internet connection got a little stable.
There we go.
You're back. Am I back?
Yes.
Okay. So just so I can clarify, the question is, where is a hospitable place to pursue this education?
I don't know if hospitable is the word, but maybe if there's any organizations or institutions that would help a young professional that are interested in getting into this kind of work, who would you recommend they kind of seek out?
I would look at the Green Burial Council for more information. The Home Funeral Alliance has all kinds of information. That's going to be geared more towards people getting into this from the death doula and home funeral guide perspective, less from the funeral director perspective. But those two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it might really behoove you to have all of those tools in your belt there. And I will say that Lake Washington Technical College, which has the regional mortuary science program, I saw an applause there, is pretty unique around the country in that they are very amenable and friendly to green burial, as well as the other emerging alternatives out there. So if you're at Lake Washington, you're in a pretty good spot.
Well, I'll make sure that I include
Lake Washington Technical College.
Yeah, there we go. I'll make sure that I share their information in our email just in case anybody didn't get a chance to write it down. I don't know if you know about this, but we do have a pretty exciting event coming up on Saturday. Maybe some of the attendees here might be interested in popping in. We're hosting a trivia night about death, and if you sat through Brian's presentation, I bet you have a little bit of a leg up on some of your competitors, knowing a little bit more about green burial than some other folks. So I'll go ahead and include the information for that. We'd love to have more folks joining us for that. It's going to be a pretty fun night. Amanda just dropped into the chat the link for that, and like I said, I'll include it in the email as well. It looks like we have a couple more minutes, maybe for one more question, if anybody's been holding on to something good. Let me just do a quick scroll through here. Okay. Well, I don't see anything in there, but if you think of something later, feel free to reach out to us or to Brian at any time. It's what we love to do, is talk about these kinds of things.
Yeah. And you can You can find my email address on the Moles Farewell Tributes website, as well as the funeral home phone number. And I love talking about green burial, so please give me a call if you have questions.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Brian. It's been, we knew this would be a wonderful use of your time.
Thank you for having me, Beverly, and thank you to PMA for all the great work that you do.
Thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and email you with some extra info later on.